Now, normally, I guess we should have an introduction, and to start this off, I think most of the people are here. I think I'm not going to spend much time introducing Allan because all of you pretty well know his work already. You may not know him personally, but you certainly have read his work over the years, and particularly the things that he's done with Jackie Eccles and so forth. And so he has a long time association with many of the self-concept sorts of things that we do, although he comes from a somewhat broader motivational kind of perspective than a major focus on self-concept, but competency and related self-beliefs constructs are central to much of what he does, and certainly some of his interaction with us. So let me go ahead and let you begin your presentation rather than taking up more time telling people what a wonderful person you are.
All right, well, thanks very much for having me. When Herb first invited me, I didn't realize it was going to be at 10:30 at night when I'm usually getting ready to go to bed. But I've come to know over the years that, you know, when Herb asks you to do something, it's always a good idea to say yes. So it's turned out to be a wonderful opportunity to have a chance to visit with you today.
Now you need to share that with my colleagues, because my colleagues at IPPE haven't learned that yet.
Well, tell them to get in touch with me afterwards, and I'll give them some tips. So now I'm just seeing my own screen, so I'm not going to be able to react immediately, but let's just kind of get going and see where this takes us here. Well, I was glad, Herb, to hear you say that people are, you know, familiar with some extent with the work that Jackie and I and others have been doing over these many years. So I'm going to focus on the expectancy value work that we've done, starting with a quick history, just to put things in long-term historical perspective, moving on to the original model that Jackie and colleagues put forward in the mid-'80s. And then from there, talk about some of the early studies. Once I got to Michigan, I got involved in some of our more recent findings from that. Then talk about one, I think, controversy in expectancy value theory right now, and I'll be interested to get your take on this. What to do with this idea of perceived cost, and then turn to a bit about what we think should come next in work on the theory, and then turning to some conversations about intervention work, since that's been a big part of expectancy value work over the last 15 to 20 years, finishing up with some suggestions that my former student Emily Rosenzweig, Jackie and I are making about where to go next. So just for starters, the expectancies and values constructs have been long-time constructs in psychology, dating all the way back to the 1930s and 1940s. Expectancy value models have been prominent in different areas of psychology as well as economics and other spheres. So the basics of the theory in terms of believing that our expectancies for success, as well as the value or variance we put on an activity, being important determinants of performance and choice, have been with us for quite some time. John Atkinson was the first to really pull together an integrated expectancy value achievement motivation theory. And I just wanted to share this for a couple of minutes because it's always intriguing to me to go back to what Atkinson said and think about how we think about motivation now. But before doing that, I thought I would share a rare photo of 3-generation of motivation scholars that the Bernie Weiner shared with me a few years back. So on my right is David McClelland with the goatee. He was Jack Atkinson's advisor. And then Jack Atkinson ends up being Bernie Weiner's advisor. So these historical photos are always kind of amazing. And there'll be one more connection, kind of taking things forward from Bernie, so you can see how we're all connected in a way. So Atkinson was into mathematical modeling, and he put forward a mathematical equation for result in achievement motivation that you can see there. That consists of motives to avoid success or to avoid failure, and then probabilities of success or incentives for success. And a couple of the important points I want to make about that is that one, he really introduced sort of situational or contextual varies into motivational theory by thinking about this, because probabilities of success are quite variable depending on the situation we are in. But also more permanent motives, the motive to approach and to avoid, are both, they thought, a bit more stable dispositions. And speaking of avoid, I'm sorry, the next point, it's interesting to look at it mathematically because, according to Atkinson, either the motive to approach success or to avoid failure was multiplicative across those three things in each parentheses, meaning, of course, if any one of them is zero, the motivation disappears. So that was a conscious choice he made. It wasn't an additive model, but multiplicative, including both approach and avoidance motives. Rich and Ed have a motivation in their model, which is maybe somewhat of an avoidance, but some other theories have sort of forgotten that over the years. And then finally, though, and most importantly, in terms of making the transition to the model we've been working with, when you manipulate that equation mathematically, incentive value ends up being the inverse of the probability of success. And we think that that was one of the things that led the field to focus more on probabilities, expectancies, competence beliefs rather than values, because values was just thought of as the inverse of expectancies rather than being something different. Another interesting thing, and this is something if you're interested, we could come back to briefly in the question and answer. According to Atkinson, we are most motivated to achieve when we got a 50-50 chance of succeeding. I just ask you to think about if that's true in most of the activities that you do in your life. That's how Atkinson solved things in terms of working through all of the mathematical combinations in his equation there. Perhaps over the long term, we would like to have a little bit more probability of success, but he was pretty convinced that this is how things work. So that's really quick on Jack Atkinson. Interestingly enough, he worked at Michigan for all the many years that Jackie Eccles was there, and I don't think they ever spoke to each other. So we have this historical trend in expectancy value theory, but the people not really getting together. So as I mentioned, Bernie Weiner was Jack Atkinson's students. Jackie studied with Bernie Weiner at UCLA and came to Michigan, and I was fortunate enough to come to Ann Arbor to work with Jackie as a postdoc in the early 1980s. And this is one of my favorite pictures of Jackie by the fountain in the castle in Heidelberg, Germany, a place that you all should visit if you haven't been there yet, from just a few years back. And so what happened with us at Michigan are kind of the following things. Jackie presented the first kind of formal presentation of her expectancy value model in '83. I came in '82 and we started thinking about how it might be playing out developmentally in different sorts of ways. And we did two major longitudinal studies, starting with a study of adolescents and then moving on to a study of early elementary school children to see how the central beliefs and values and the theories develop. And so I think Jackie and I both consider ourselves to be developmental as well as educational psychologists, and central for us has always been how these things develop and what they relate to. Now, just if you can remember back to Atkinson's equation a minute ago, the model that Jackie put forward, it's got some arrows, and so in that sense, perhaps there's some mathematical things about it, but clearly it's not a mathematical formula in the way that Atkinson talked about. And of course, I should start at the left and go box by box, and we'll be here until much later than midnight my time, so I'm not going to do that. But the main thing I wanted to point out in this figure is looking at the far right. The reason that we continue to call it an expectancy value model is because Jackie proposed back in the early 80s that our expectancies for success, as well as the value that we have for the different activities that we do, are the main strong predictors of achievement-related choices and the performance that we get involved with. And so some of the fundamental differences between what Jackie was doing at this point and what we built on was, first of all, and really importantly, not seeing task value as just the inverse of expectancy for success, but seeing that values can have different characteristics or aspects that are going to relate out to choice in different sorts of ways. And initially, Jackie and colleagues defined 4 of these: interest value, intrinsic value, which is similar to the construct of interest that Ann Renninger and others have worked on, somewhat similar to intrinsic motivation, but not as, I think, in depth as that. Attainment value, having to do with the importance of the activity to the individual. In a more recent works, Jackie's been writing a lot about how it ties to our identity and sense of self. So tasks or activities become important to us to the extent we see them fitting in with how we're doing. Utility value, something has usefulness even if we might not be interested in it. So I have to take a certain set of math courses in order to get into med school, even if I don't really particularly want to take those courses. And then last, perceived cost. So what I have to give up in order to be able to do something. So this afternoon, you all gave up things to come to hear Wigfield talk. I appreciate that. I'm glad to see that Rich didn't give up his hard cider and his popcorn listening to me. So perhaps the costs aren't so great on your end. And then the other thing going on here is that there were many socialization and personal factors that go into determining expectancies values, things that Atkinson didn't spend that much time talking about. So it becomes a much broader model having to do with understanding the reasons and the development of expectancies values out to the relation of performance and choice. And importantly, and a point we'll come back to later, they developed the model to deal with a problem that was central at the time, and actually in many ways still is, why young women were opting out of math and science careers. There was a social, psychological, cultural model trying to explain that particular phenomenon. So, as I think I briefly mentioned at the beginning, the two main things that I had worked on across these many years is how do expectancies, self-concepts, task value develop across the school years, and then how and whether can we intervene to enhance kids' expectancies and values in school performance. So that's my entire career in 2 bullet points. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions now. Yeah, not really. We'll keep going here. So let me just present a few findings from our Michigan transition study, looking at the transition from elementary school to middle school in terms of changes in self-concept, task values, and self-esteem. What we did was measured kids' beliefs and values over 4 time points, pre and post transition, and found that for the most part, kids' competence, beliefs, and values decline, particularly across the transition to 7th grade. So during 6th grade, some stability in most cases, but after 7th grade, things went down. And many of you will probably get a chuckle out of the fact that at the time that this study was published, the state of the art for analyzing change was repeated measures multivariate analysis of variance. So I proudly did those and reported them myself in our developmental psychology article about that. What this study and other studies at the time did, they were, I think, somewhat instrumental in leading to some of the changes in the US schools that led to what was called the middle school movement, getting away from the traditional junior high school movement to try to make schools more developmentally appropriate and friendly to kids as they were going through other transitions, like the transition into puberty. And if anybody's interested in that particular aspects of the study, we can talk more about that later. A second really important finding, and one I think we were a little surprised at first, was that even for relatively young students, if you look at the stability correlations across a couple of waves and even across the 2-year period, particularly by the time kids are in the older grade level, their self-concepts and their values, particularly the self-concepts, are getting relatively stable. And we think that has some potentially important implication for intervention, suggesting that if you want to budge these beliefs, that maybe you need to start a little bit earlier there. And I think that's the point I'll come back to when talking about some of our intervention work later on. So we have overall declines in children's beliefs and values across the transition, concern about what that meant for kids' schooling, and yet at the same time increasing stability, particularly in self-concepts of ability in different domains, with some of those getting pretty solid. Okay, so what I was really interested in when coming to Michigan was seeing if we could begin to identify the beliefs and values earlier than high school or middle school, which is where Jackie and colleagues have focused most of their work. And so a couple of years after I had got to Michigan, we began a study called the Child and Beyond Study, which we actually in-house finally called the Little Kids Project to distinguish it from the studies of adolescents. But what we were quite interested in was seeing whether young kids as early as 1st grade, whether their competence, beliefs, and values are distinguishable, how those change over the course of the school years, and how they relate out to performance and choice. And so we had a cohort sequential design, 3 cohorts, multiple measurement points, about 1,000 kids at the beginning of the study. As you can see, relatively limited in terms of socioeconomic status as well as racial backgrounds. And one of our biggest challenges is trying to figure out how early can we use questionnaires to measure the motivational beliefs and values that we're interested in. This is a question I know Herb is quite interested in as well. How far down can we push these measures and still get meaningful information from the students? So there's a look at the study's design. What happened was we started with the 3 cohorts, where the gray boxes are there in the middle as we lost funding for a while, resumed funding, basically getting the kids through the end of secondary school. And actually, people in Michigan have followed them now into their 30s. So it's become quite a long-term longitudinal study here, and we've been excited. As I said, began to get really interested in thinking about the model developmentally. So with Jackie, we published a paper on task value in developmental review back in 1992, trying to emphasize it more than self-efficacy, self-concept of ability, and other sorts of constructs that were really at the forefront at the time, talking about where values might come from, how they relate to competence beliefs, and other aspects of the model. And then a couple of years later, writing something about, what does children's understanding of either competence or values look like when they're younger as compared to older? Which aspects of task value might come out first, thinking that perhaps most likely it was interest, with something like utility coming later, because it's a little hard to figure out when you're a young kid what's going to be useful for you. And also talking about how the predictive links to performance and choice get stronger. And the CAB study was designed to test some of these things, as we'll see momentarily here. So what happens with the factor structure work that we did initially was we were able to show 2 fundamental things. First, within any given domain, and just look at math as an example there, we were able to show that even in first grade children, that beliefs about ability and the values aspects factored separately. So that was one. We didn't necessarily expect that. We thought they might go together. And in fact, we thought kids might have a more general sense of academic competence overall and think even that the math and reading self-concepts might go together. But they also factor separately as well. So across domains, ability beliefs are distinct, as are task values. Within a domain, ability beliefs are distinct from values. Herb has since shown that you can take this down even younger, to kindergarten or 4-year-olds, but this work was some of the first work showing that kids seem to have differentiated beliefs and values quite early during the school years. And it's interesting to think about what some of the reasons for that might be. With respect to the different components of value, we didn't have that measured in the with enough items in the childhood and beyond study, but in other data sets, we were able to find that by 5th grade, the 3 different aspects of value that 3 of the aspects of value that I mentioned earlier factor separately as well. And colleagues at Tübingen have built greatly on this work, showing that even more dimensions of value can be distinguished in 4th or 5th grade. So again, values are fairly highly correlated, as you can see in the following slide, but they are distinguishable. And so as a result, maybe have differential predictive power over different kinds of outcomes. And speaking of that, oh no, I'm sorry, next we'll go to the change over time in kids' expectancies and values. And the slides I'm going to show you are all from the same study, but looking at the data set in different sorts of ways. So this is our first paper on a change in math and language arts competence beliefs, was published in Child Development back in 2002, using HLM to assess the change over time. And essentially what we found there, I think the 2 important things, like the MSEL study, kids' beliefs about their competence tend to decline across the school years. Interestingly, and I'm sorry it's cut off, girls and boys differed at the beginning, with girls having lower competence beliefs in math than boys did, but by the end of the study in this particular sample, they were essentially equivalent, which is quite different than some of the earlier data Jackie had about boys and girls' belief about their math competence during the high school years. Interestingly, with language arts, the gender differences are not there at first, but here you can see that across the school years, boys got less confident in their ability to do language arts, where girls stayed a little bit more stable in that regard. And the differences between boys and girls are significant through the high school years. So there's been much ado about girls in math. Perhaps there should be some ado about boys in reading, which I know there has been, but it doesn't seem to get quite as much attention. The last point from this first study was we controlled for confidence beliefs and looked at how task values change once that occurred. And it really reduced the variance in the change in values by a large extent, which has led us to argue, as I think Bandura argued in some of his work, the self-efficacy area, that competence beliefs, at least in these achievement situation areas, tends to drive change in kids' valuing of activities. So if I'm continuing to think that I'm doing well, then I'll be more likely to have positive value for that. Maybe that's less true in recreational activities, but it seems to be working in these areas in which we're being evaluated. So that's the normative pattern of change. And again, much has been written about this and other similar findings from other research groups. You know, why are kids' beliefs and values declining? And what does that mean about what's going on in schools? And what can we potentially do about that? And the normative change is all well and good to describe in this way. But what people have been doing more recently is looking at how there are different patterns of change across different groups. And this is using the same childhood and beyond data set, looking at kids' competence beliefs and values in reading area this time. And you can see most kids are showing declines, but you can also see that there's quite a few different patterns of that, and particularly some of the kids coming back towards the end of the high school years, their beliefs and values are getting more positive again. So I find finding like this and this next finding slide to be really fascinating. What we haven't been able to do with our data so far, at least, has been able to look to see exactly what's predicting who's going to be in these different trajectories. But it's important to note that they're there, which second half of the talk has some implications possibly for intervention and which interventions might work for which students. Then the last one of these, published just recently in Child Development with some of my colleagues from Tübingen, looking not just at change over time in one domain, but how growth mixture modeling shows us how kids' beliefs and values, particularly intrinsic value and ability self-concept, look form into different classes across the school years. And we found 2 broad classes for mathematics and 3 for intrinsic valuing. And you can kind of see possibly the interplay of the 2 sets there between language arts and math. If you have questions about the particular analyses that were done, I would be very happy to give you Hannah Gaspard's email address, because the analyses that they're doing are beyond my pay grade at this point. So it's fun to think about the results and what they mean, but I'm not doing these analyses right now. Let's turn to the relations of performance and choice. In the interest of time, we'll just do it that way. So some of our most important findings regarding this are that, as the model predicted, expectancy to success are the strongest direct predictor of performance, whereas subjective task values are the strongest direct predictor of choices and intentions to keep doing things. And we've showed this in short-term and longitudinal studies now. I've got another slide in a minute, but the subjective task value one of the most interesting findings to my mind was a study done looking at how kids' valuing of reading in 4th grade predicted their engagement in literacy activities and when they were 16, and values were a stronger predictor than their expectancies for success. But because expectancies and values themselves are related, they each have indirect effects on the other outcome. And the next slide can show you that to a degree. So you can see how expectancies, the strongest predictor of grades, importance, one of the aspects of values out to intentions in this case, not actual choices. We have data with choice as well. But because values and expectancies relate, there's indirect effects across the models there. More recently, again, the Tübingen folks have been looking at how expectancy by value interaction terms predict performance and choice. There's some really large scale studies they've shown those terms don't have a huge additional impact, but they do predict more variance than the main effect terms themselves. So it's important to keep considering the interactions of the two. Looking at longer term choice, we published a paper back in 2015 showing that the trajectories of kids' expectancies and values measured up until towards the end of the high school years predicted the choice of college major quite clearly. So the kids whose expectancies and values, for example, in STEM areas were positive were much more likely to go into those majors. even looking as far back as 4th grade in terms of the predictive links. And then most recently, the same Gaspard study just mentioning that trajectories that we found in that study are predicting out to career choice into participants' 30s. So the beliefs and values seem to have long-term impacts on really important actions that individuals are involved in. So that was kind of a sketch of much of the data that I was working on during my many years at Michigan. Jackie and I have had the opportunity to write a couple papers recently, kind of taking a look at where we are and where we think the theory should be going. I'll put in a plug for Rich Ryan and Ed Deasy's paper in the same special issue of Contemporary Educational Psychology on Motivation Theory. They have a wonderful paper in there as well. But we've been thinking about some of the things that we believe moving forward would be important things to do. And we changed the name to Situated Expectancy-Value Model to try to get a clearer sense of the context-bound and specific situations in which the decisions that people make are going on, to make it seem like it's a more dynamic and active sort of model. The two-dimensional characterization is always one that we struggle with, and we think that by trying to really make it clear that we think about the decisions happening in real time in certain situations with different constraints is a better way to think about that, and also a better way to guide research and understanding relations of expectancies values to different outcomes in different circumstances. And I think it's also, there's been a push for situated views and motivation in the literature, and I think it was our attempt to try to go through that as well, to see if these views can perhaps be integrated over time, something I've been thinking a fair amount about lately. So I think some of the things, what I'm going to do in the interest of time is, I'm going to skip over the cost thing, and it can come back to that if we have time potentially. But I wanted to talk a little bit about where we think SEVT-based work is going, and talk some about the intervention work, and then potentially can come back to cost. So because we use survey data for the most part, and the kind of statistical modeling that we're doing, we've been quite interested in trying to understand more clearly the different psychological processes involved in forming expectancies and values. And Jackie Jens Moeller and I had a paper from 2020 talking about the different sorts of comparisons, and of course Herb has written much about these as well, how those influence the development of expectancies and values. So trying to understand not just links, but relationships amongst them. I think Rainer Peckrin's work on affect in relation to expectancies, values, control beliefs is really an important area. And I think we're trying to understand better as well some of the active processes beyond expectancies and values. So moving forward, I think we'd like to see more of those kinds of work there. Another thing we've been quite interested in is hierarchies of expectancies and values. People tend to look at them one at a time. So how does my math self-concept predict out to my math achievement or my valuing of math? But we all have different hierarchies of expectancies and or values from top to bottom, and think that they might work together in ways that influence choice and performance in much more interesting and complex ways than we've been able to understand so far. And we're looking forward to seeing how people begin to play those kinds of ideas, so go beyond just individual beliefs and values to look at them in multifaceted sorts of ways. So taking a deep breath and pause, and now we'll talk a bit about the intervention work, which has sort of been the second passion of mine for the last 20 years of my career. But just to kind of briefly tell you how I got there, after working at Michigan for many years, I moved to Maryland in about 1990 and began working with John Guthrie, a reading scholar, who didn't know much about motivation, was interested in it, and I didn't know a lot about reading, but was interested in it. And so we decided that we would work together to develop interventions that to focus on both reading comprehension and motivation. And there's not a lot of interventions like that out there, particularly classroom-based ones. And so what we tried to do was to take the best in reading strategy instruction and put that together with different ideas from the motivation literature to see whether we could enhance kids' motivation as well as the reading comprehension. So we borrowed autonomy support from Rich and Ed's work. We borrowed interest from Anne Renninger's work, Value and Self-Efficacy as a Concept from a variety of works, and Social Motivation Critical as well. So this work is theoretically eclectic. It's going to contrast with the expectancy value intervention work, which is both single variable and sort of theoretical monistic. It'd be interesting to see what you think about that. Is that a good thing, or is it just kind of the way it is that you have to use a variety of things in order to make an impact, particularly in school? And what we found in studies in both elementary and middle school is that kids that have our core programs, motivation and engagement increase, their amount of reading. Particularly proud of the reading comprehension effects. It's often hard to get those. But where that left us, and where that ties to the intervention data or work based on SEVT, is trying to thinking about how do we understand when we intervene on motivation what's working, and whether the whole is greater than the sum of their parts, or if you can pull things out and look at things individually. Well, how would that work? What's going to happen with that? Well, interestingly, at about the same time that we were winding up this work, the motivation field started doing work focusing on just single variables for the most part, rather than doing the more complex interventions that John and I were doing. One example I'm sure you're all familiar with is work on mindset, Carol Dweck's notion of two different kinds of beliefs of intelligence that we have. And there's been a variety of interventions around the mindset construct that have had small but measurable effects. Greg Walton in 2014 called these wise interventions because he argued what they do is they change our psychological processing of information we're receiving over the long term. So even though they're simple, focusing on one thing, they lead to a revolution in how kids think about their world and their achievement. And so one of the areas, as I just mentioned, is mindsets. But there's been a variety of studies based in expectancy value theory, which you've been happy to see. And interestingly enough, most of this work is focused on the utility value part of the value set of value, number, intrinsic, utility, and attainment. And I've always been curious about why that is. Judy Harakevich in her writing said that they chose utility value initially because they thought it was potentially the most malleable of the value components. But what they do in their work is to try to get students to understand the value of the subject areas they're taking, either by writing quotes themselves or by reading up quotes that others say, a relatively simple manipulation. And one of the most, I think, powerful and important studies coming out of Judy's lab, she showed in first-generation underrepresented minority students that the achievement gap in an introductory biology class between those groups and majority students was reduced by 60%, which was kind of an astounding finding in this relatively simple intervention that she implemented there. Once again, the Tübingen group has been working in the math area, again, focusing on utility value, and they've shown positive effects on children's valuing of math and math performance over a number of years here. My former student, Emily Rosenzweig, has been working on developing interventions to reduce the perceived cost of an activity. And in her case, looking at cost of physics, because physics is often thought to be a really difficult subject area and one you have to spend a lot of time on. So she was interested in seeing whether she could develop a way to intervene to reduce college students' sense of cost, along with doing the utility value intervention. And so, again, what she developed was a set of quotes from other students about how they overcame the challenges of taking physics, and found that the interventions, both the utility value one, which mimic the ones that Judy and colleagues have done at Wisconsin, and her cost one, increased kids' exam scores, also their competence beliefs, particularly for the initial lower performing students in the physics classes. And those students also reported a bit lower costs as well. So we were encouraged that an initial venture into dealing with cost had success as far as boosting kids' performance and motivation in a college physics class. Oh, I'm sorry, that wasn't what I meant to do. So we're in the process now. Paper finally is going to be accepted within the next week or so, kind of talking about ways in which intervention work based on expectancy value theory can move forward. We're trying to talk about well, I think the why it should occur is because kids' expectancies and values have been shown to decline. They relate to performance. So if we can do some enhancement of it, that's probably going to be a good thing. And so, but in thinking about how we move beyond utility value, I think it's really critical for people to think very carefully about what sorts of outcomes are they looking at, because the different beliefs and values predict them differentially. How early can we begin these? What's realistic in terms of some of the nature of these constructs and the way that they're defined? And how might they be moderated by different sorts of things? So we're talking about a variety of decision points. The first is, should we stick with the single variable interventions that have been all the rage over the last 15 or so years? Or like the OERI work, should we be focusing on more than one construct to perhaps reach more students and to perhaps have more powerful effects? What are the costs and benefits of doing one or the other of those? And I would greatly enjoy hearing your reactions to that when we have time for some questions and answers. Then the second decision is, what outcome does an intervention researcher want to affect? It's kind of amazing that oftentimes when people do these sorts of intervention studies, that they don't really clearly indicate that they chose to intervene on construct X because they wanted to impact outcome X, but they just chose a construct and an outcome and see what happens. Particularly within the realm of expectancy value theory, because expectancies relate more to performance, values more to choice. Researchers need to think carefully about what they're targeting in terms of which one of those things that they want to affect more thoroughly. How early can these interventions be successful? I'll pause for a minute and let you think to yourselves. Utility value, an activity being useful to a student over the longer term. When can kids start thinking about that meaningfully? Well, Mimi Bong and colleagues in Korea have done a study with 4th grade students showing that enhancing their sense of the utility of math had some positive motivational effects. I'm a little bit surprised at that finding. Actually, to me, utility is a fairly abstract construct. Pushing it earlier, maybe that could be a little bit more difficult. I think with interests, those can be stimulated quite early on. Interventions potentially could start earlier dealing with boosting kids' interest. And in fact, that was one of the things John Guthrie and I did a lot in the OERI work, is worked on getting kids initially interested in some activities, leading them to reading. Attainment value, probably more like utility value, particularly given its ties to identity. And expectancies and competence beliefs, they begin to correlate relatively strongly with achievement in middle elementary school years. And so I think maybe that time can be working as well. So the choice of whether to keep doing one of these, to do multiple together, and when we want to start them, I think are all really important questions for the intervention work moving forward. And we're looking forward to seeing the steps that people take as they begin to do that. Some moderators, though, I think some of the initial excitement, I don't want to say has worn off about the single variable interventions, but it's clear that the effects vary across different students. So lower achievers more than higher achievers, maybe not surprisingly. Kids that have lower expectancies coming in tend to benefit more. Sometimes gender moderates, sometimes it doesn't. But I think we're beginning to understand the nuances of these interventions more clearly now. And moving ahead, those will all have to be taken into account as the literature moves forward. So those are my 2 concluding points. And by my watch, it's 11:15. I could go back and run through the cost slides, or we could answer questions. And if I could say a time or two about cause, what is your brothers there in Australia and in northern New York State?